Nowadays there aren't many loops in Dead by Daylight that could be classified as infinite. Probably the closest thing to an infinite loop currently is that one house with the 2 window vaults on the first floor in Haddonfield, but other than that, the game is pretty much clear of infinite loops. However, what if I told you that during the early days of DBD's existence, infinites were pretty much the norm and they were literally everywhere. Most maps in 2016 used to have at least one infinite loop. But what was so different back then, and how did we get to where we are today? Well, in this video we're going to be discussing the downfall of infinite loops in Dead by Daylight, so without any further ado, let's get right into it. First, let's start by classifying what exactly is an infinite loop. An infinite loop, or infinite for short, is a structure where the killer is simply unable to catch the survivor no matter what they do. The structure normally involves one or more very safe windows. But how is this possible, you may ask? Wouldn't the windows get blocked? Well, first of all, the entity blocker mechanic hadn't been introduced yet, which meant that a survivor could vote the same window indefinitely. Second, the vaulting animation for killers was more than 1.5 times lower than how it is today. Third, the medium vault didn't exist, and survivors could perform a fast vote no matter the angle nor the momentum, as long as they were holding down the sprint button when performing the action. Oh, and also, Bloodlust wasn't in the game either, and would not be implemented up until the 1.5.0 patch in April 2017, almost a full year after the game's initial release. Now, even though nowadays the shack is still considered a pretty strong and safe structure for survivors, back in 2016 it was even stronger. As you can see, instead of the God palette that we currently have, there was actually another window vault. This, paired with the stuff I mentioned earlier, made this one of the safest places for survivors in the entire game. Now, which version of DBD is this exactly? Well, this is actually still the beta, and the existence of the Shack Infinite could be traced further back to the alpha versions of the game. Now, before the actual full release of Dead by Daylight on the 14th of June 2016, the Macmillan Estate was the only available realm, which back then included just 4 maps: Ironworks of Misery, Cold Tower, Shelter Woods, and the Suffocation Pit. And even though the official release of the game removed one of the windows in the shack and replaced it with the God palette that we all know today, it brought 2 new realms, Coldwind Farm and Auto Haven Wreckers, and with that came, you guessed it, more infinites. And it wasn't like the ones in the Macmillan maps had gotten removed either, oh no. You know how today, right next to this window vault on the main building of the Ironworks of Misery map, there is currently a hole in the wall? Well, this hole simply wasn't there back in 2016. Not only that, but right outside there was actually a pallet as well. Furthermore, on the second floor of this building there was yet another infinite loop, and even though this one was a little riskier, you could say, I guess, it was still ridiculously overpowered. Now, the strength of a lot of these early infinite loops came not only from the fact that the entity blocker mechanic didn't exist, but also from the sheer amount of window vaults that were available on the map. Take Wretched Shop for example. There are literally 3 open window vaults all at once, and True Talent, who is playing great in this clip and who even back then was a very good killer player, cannot possibly do anything to counter this. And remember, originally the developers said that infinite looping took skill to perform. This takes skill. And once again, almost every map had at least 1 or sometimes more infinite loops. For example, on the Wretched Shop, except for the main building, the so-called Fun Bus was also an infinite loop, which, although not guaranteed, had a pretty good chance to spawn on the map. Another example is just about every single Coldwind Farm map. The Fractured Cowshed originally had a pretty similar layout to the Wretched Shop, with the front portion having 3 available window vaults at once, while the Rancid Abattoir had 2 incredibly safe window vaults. Oh, and the Cow Tree was also an infinite loop, I forgot to mention. You can check out my video on that if you're interested. Other notable infinite loops were the Suffocation Pit, the Cold Tower, and Torment Creek. Thankfully, the developers noticed the unfair strength of infinite loops and were relatively quick to act on that. During the 1.0.4 update, only a little bit more than a month after the original release of the game, the developers added the so-called dynamic window blocker. Now, this is not to be confused with the entity blocker. What the dynamic window blocker meant was that on some maps, some window votes would be blocked by barricades and therefore unable to be interacted with. This affected a lot of window loops, and depending on the RNG, sometimes the setups wouldn't be that much in the survivor's favor. Additionally, tiles like the cow tree received completely reworked layouts, and the fun bus was given 2 new variations so that only one of the window votes would be available at a given time. Now, this was a good start, but it definitely wasn't enough. Still, the next big update, that actually being the first ever DBD chapter, The Last Breath, introduced a new map, Crowspren Asylum, the main building of which, you guessed it, contained yet another new infinite loop. This patch also implemented the balanced landing perk, which at that time specifically wasn't very significant, but just keep that perk in mind for later. Now, probably one of the most important updates in DBD's entire history is 1.1.2, since this was when the entity blocker mechanic was finally implemented in the game. This was a pretty harsh nerf for the survivor side as a whole, however, in my opinion at least, it was much needed. All of these mechanics changes relating to window votes were great, however, when the next Dead by Daylight chapter rolled around, that being the Halloween DLC, this update also brought one of the most hated maps in DBD's entire history. Why was Haddonfield such a big problem? Well, for starters, the exhausted status effect wasn't a part of the game yet, and so by pairing the balanced landing perk with one of the 2-story houses in Haddonfield, you could essentially get infinite reduced stagger for the whole match, which resulted in one of the most notorious infinite loops in the game ever. Thankfully, with the 1.5.0 patch, the exhausted status effect was finally added to the game. Furthermore, players also saw the addition of the bloodlust mechanic for the first time, and from that point on, things suddenly began to take a slightly different turn. The balanced landing perk finally received its long-awaited balance rework on the 3rd of December 2019 during the 3.4.0 update. Basically, the perk would no longer grant the stagger reduction while exhausted. This thankfully got rid of the infamous Haddonfield Infinite up to a certain extent. However, the real end of infinite loops was actually brought a couple of patches later with the 3.7.0 update. See, up to that point, even though many new mechanics had been added to the game over the years, such as the entity blocker and bloodlust, the window votes that originally caused the actual infinite loops in the first place were left relatively untouched, believe it or not. And so this update changed many of those loops by either completely removing the problematic window votes, reducing their strength quite a bit, or simply adding a doorway to the side of them. For example, on the Wretched Shop, 2 out of the 3 window votes would now always be blocked by barricades, therefore making the first window significantly weaker in the process. Another example is on the Rancid Abattoir, where this window vote previously was incredibly strong, but thanks to this new doorway that the developers had added, it actually had possible counterplay from the killer side now. Well, even though these changes didn't last very long, because of the Realm Beyond update changes and breakable wall implementations, this was still one of the most important patches in DBD's history, as it paved the way for modern map generation and loop designs. Currently, I guess one of the few loops that could still be considered an infinite is, again, the 2-story house on Haddonfield, which has these 2 very strong window votes on the first floor. But in my opinion, the game is mostly clear of infinite loops. Well, yeah, I guess that was it. We went through the entire evolution of infinites in Dead by Daylight. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then make sure to let me know by leaving a like, and also I would be glad if you considered subscribing as well. Anyways, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!